Concordance, so that we can find the right word, so that we can look it up in the dictionary, the lexicon, and get the word meaning. Well, when you're talking about an idiom, idioms are a specific way of saying something that don't really have anything to do with the language. We just ascribe meaning to them, and there is a trail that gets us to why this should mean that. But now that we're here, one of the things that's extremely important to understand about an idiom is that the words in an idiom do not rely on their dictionary definitions.
Right.
So in this case, she hit the roof. We know what that means, but hit and roof have no meaning. None. If you're looking at this and you go to your lexicon and you look up hit and you write down all the definitions and you look up roof and you write down all the definitions, all you'll get is a description of somehow some woman hitting a roof. But you will completely miss the whole point. So when I said, are you reading an idiom, you got to know that before you start looking up words, because if you look up the words, all that you can guarantee is that you'll misunderstand what you're reading, even though you looked it up.
Right.
It's the looking up that made you misunderstand it.
Right.
Well, that sounds backwards, but it's part of understanding. These are some of the things that translators face. You got to know if you're reading an idiom. Here's an idiom in German, one of my favorites. Aber soll das nicht für möglich halten? It's one of my favorite ones.
Singing that too.
Yeah, I know you love that one too, as soon as I tell you what it means.
Reminds me of scorpions.
Okay. Now, so let's do a literal equivalency translation. One word for one word. But should it not for possible hold? Well, imagine that you're reading along and you read this sentence. If you don't know German, you'll go to work. I mean, pretend this is in the Bible, right? And you read this. As a good, devout believer, knowing that God's word is perfect, you'll immediately set about trying to figure out what message God has for you in that passage. But if you know German, when you read it, you'll go, oh, yeah, aber soll das nicht für möglich halten, of course. You know what it means, because it's an idiom in that language. But if you do a word-for-word literal equivalency, you won't get it. So that's where functional equivalency helps. Okay?
Right.
Functional equivalency, that's literal equivalency. So a functional equivalency would be, but can that really be possible? Does that make more sense?
Yeah.
That makes a lot more sense. That's functional equivalency. Now, you wanted to understand the difference between functional equivalency and dynamic equivalency. So now I'm not restricting myself to trying to use these words anymore to say what the original author said. Now I'm just going to take that in my language and just say it how I would say it. Okay? Now that's how a German might say, no way. Okay?
Right.
It's a little lengthier. And that's dynamic equivalence. See, it's a pretty big difference.
Yeah, because if someone said, but can that really be possible? Like, I could see where that would be, it could be an exclamation like, wow, no way. But it says, like, you could actually be asking a question.
So this is a possible thing where...
eliminates no way.
Right, so a dynamic equivalency might be better. It might be more useful to you to internalize it, because you're more familiar with speaking that way. Or it might leave things out. So it's a mixed bag. You can't just say for sure, this is our approach and it's going to be that way across the board. But that's what translation committees have to face. They have to decide what's the way to do this translation. So you might come up with a kind of a loose one.
One method for the entire translation.
Pretty much
what
think
they
so.
do. They just go with one method.
Kind of have to pick one. And fortunately, they put notes in the beginning of translations describing their approach. So at least you can know what might be going on in your translation. So it's, I think, a good idea to read those so you know what's going on, what approach they took, who the translators are, do they even believe in God, kind of important. Or it might not be important.
Or what their viewpoints are. They could think it completely different
Right.
presented in a different way.
It's real popular these days to have an extremely minimalist view of the Bible. In other words, saying none of these people were real, none of these things really happened. I mean, that's pretty common. That's more popular now.
Or these people just wrote down whatever they thought, and is the Bible really true? Because it's been translated
it's just another myth.
from this or this or that. You know? And then you got that now this.
Right. Here we're back. I told you we'd come back to that. Now here's a case where we've been talking about Hebrew, we've been talking about Greek, because the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament, pretty much everyone knows that was written in Hebrew. And the New Testament was written in Greek. Pretty much people accept that. I don't, but...
I thought it was Aramaic. I'm sorry.
Yeah, these are options. No, but all the copies that we have that people study are Greek.
Right.
Yeah, that's where it originally came from.
That's what they say was the original writing.
Someone decided that.
Someone decided that. It's not a stupid assumption. I mean, like we talked about earlier, there's 5,000 texts in Greek and not very many in other languages. So, what are you going to study?
Comment the language that tied them all together. Because that's the one that all the different groups were speaking.
Well, remember when we looked at the land earlier?
Yeah, that's what I think. It's
Greek was a trade language?
Right.
Yeah, like English.
Greek was a trade language, but Aramaic was what they call the lingua franca. That's what the common, everyone spoke their own language, but they all together spoke this other language so they could talk to each other. And that used to be Aramaic. When the Assyrians conquered everything, they decided it would be a lot more efficient to just make everybody use Aramaic. So that's how that got. It wasn't a big population. It was Abraham's people, some nomads. That's who spoke Aramaic. But they came up with a writing system that was really slick. And so the Assyrians, who had all these cuneiform tablets and these millions of little triangles on the clay, thought, you know what, that's easier. Let's use that. And it'll be easier to operate the empire. More people can learn how to write. We'll be able to get things done more. So Aramaic became the whole thing. Well, then that was in place. Then Alexander the Great comes through and he spreads Greek. So that's how Greek gets overlaid on top of Aramaic. But they never let go of the Aramaic. They just added Greek. So now you start having a lot, not that people were conversant in Greek, but they could get along. Just like if you lived in Southern California and grew up in Southern California, you're going to know quite a little bit of Spanish. That doesn't mean you can speak Spanish, but it means you can say certain things that every time you come in contact with these people, you have to know how to say, so you learn those things. So you got Greek and Aramaic in that capacity, and then every country has their own language that they normally speak. Well, whatever the story is, there's Aramaic involved. And whether or not the original gospel writers and everybody wrote in Greek, there's still, the manuscripts that we have aren't super old. So there's plenty of time for lots of people to want their own copy in their own language. So you could have somebody speaking in Hebrew, somebody copying in from memory in Greek, let's say, and then somebody wanting a copy in their language of Syriac, which is a version of Aramaic, and they keep a good copy of it, and then the earlier Greek manuscripts decay, and then later on somebody says, well, I want a copy of that too, but I want it in Greek, so they take your Syriac copy and they copy it back into Greek, and we have those. So there's all these things, there's plenty of time for all this stuff to happen. Once in a while, the old Syriac texts are helpful. This, I think, is one of those occasions. Now, this is what I talked about earlier when I said you need to be honest when you read something. There's a difference between saying, I can see that this passage is deep and meaningful, and I'd like to understand more about it. It's a totally other thing to just be honest about your language and say, in English, this means nothing. And I think this is an example of that. For one would hardly give his life for a righteous man, but he might be willing to die for a good man. That means nothing in English. But I actually, just because I was curious, went through and read a lot of commentaries, and by golly, if they aren't trying to prove why you would die for the good man but not the righteous man, they go hard to work trying to figure out the reasons why